Hey everyone, it's Coach Malcolm here today. I'm going to be doing something very similar to my last video. The theme of today's lesson is Zugzwang, which if you don't know what Zugzwang is, Zugzwang is basically when you put your opponents, or you are put in a position where you have no good moves whatsoever. Any move, it's just not going to work out well for you. Either you lose material, you get checkmated, you lose the game. There's a whole range of different ways Zugzwang can manifest and can happen in games. So today again we're going to be doing one of the lessons provided on chess.com on endgames and how Zugzwang can be used in endgames. So this is I'm glad they started off with this one. This is one of the most basic ones. Sorry about that. This is one of the most basic examples of Zugzwang. So what are we trying to do? Of course we're trying to get this pawn on f4 so we can get our own pawn to promote, right? And how do we get this pawn? Well, obviously we need to take it with our king. So the most immediate move that may come to mind is king e4. But then black would be able to put us in this term Zugzwang by playing king g3. Because if we can picture it in that position, the pawn covers e3 and the king is guarding f3 from this king on g3, but he's going to have to move away and this pawn can't move. So there are no good moves. So instead, we're going to go after this pawn first with king e5, attacking the pawn. Black's only move is to guard it with king g3, of course. So they play king g3, and now we are going to put them into Zugzwang with king e4. They have no good moves. Our pawn stops them from going to g4. Our king is attacking f4. h4 is not going to guard it. They chose to go back to g2, and now, of course, we take. And we are going to be able to win this game, especially because it's going to be particularly easy. The king is already outside the box of the pawn. As I was saying, if king e4, this is a huge mistake. Now king g3, the king will likely maybe try and come around, but still, no way to get around. This pawn is going to have an easy travel, an easy trip to f1. The same can be said for our actual move, king e5. After king g3, king e4. Let's say this king tries to get around to be in front of this pawn. We are going to be able to cut that king off. And be all right in this position. And this is going to be, I mean, you can just see the analysis. This also deals with opposition, getting opposition from this king. Not necessarily king e6 here, because then f4 can't be played. But we are going to be able to get opposition regardless. If this king went back to f7, we could continue going on and on with this whole variation. But this is going to be a win for white after king e7 especially. Okay? So that's just the first example of Zugzwang. I wanted to make it very clear because we're going to be obviously doing more. Okay, here's our second example. This is very, very similar, of course. They've just added two pawns on the side of the board, and that means we have to take into account those pawns. Because like I said before, Zugzwang is when your opponent has no good moves. Now we have another piece that can do additional moves if given the chance. So we want it to be black to move. Let's just imagine these pawns aren't on the board. We want it to be black to move in this position because we know they'll move away and we'll take on f4. Okay? So we have to make it so that our last move with our pawn, or so that we move our pawn, and that after we move our pawn, or after we move our pawn after one or two moves, black has no options. They can only move their king. We must stop this pawn, right? So the point is, these pawns are eventually, sorry, this is a little confusing, but these pawns are eventually going to clash. Whether it's on a5 and a4, or a4 and a3, they are eventually going to meet straight on, head on. And when they meet straight head on, we need it to be black to move. Otherwise, we are going to be in trouble. So what do I mean? If we play a4, pawn goes to a5, these pawns have clashed, there's no more moves, and then we are in Zugzwang because our king has to move. But if we play a3, now black plays a5. Once these pawns clash on a4, they are stuck, meaning they're stuck. They have not a collision, I guess. They're just almost stuck in traffic. Now this king has to move. We've made it so it's black to move in this position, and we take on f4 with a win yet again. Okay? Sorry, that was a little confusing. Here, this puzzle is super, super interesting. This is a checkmating puzzle that uses Zugzwang. So black is going to use Zugzwang. What's important to notice is that all of these squares are taken from this white king. Okay? We don't want to play something like g5. Then the king's going to go after h5. After king takes g3, king takes h6, king takes h3, king takes g5. That's just going to be, that would be a king versus king draw with the king on h3, sorry, and the king on g5, if we can picture that. So we don't want to move one of these pawns. Same thing happens with h5. Then this king would head on over to g5 to take g6, and h5 soon after. So we're going to first bring our king into f3. And the point of f3 also is to take away this square, g4. Now the pawn moves, and we have to think again. So if you want to take a second, pause your videos, that's fine. Hopefully we found super smart move. This is the Zugzwang move. King to f4. This king has no squares whatsoever, right? The pawns are guarding, or his own pawns are keeping him out, g4 and h3. And then g3 is, of course, attacked by the king, and our pawns do the rest of the job over here. So once they push, now pawn takes g5 is indeed checkmate, h takes g5, and it is over for white here. All right. Our fourth puzzle is another tricky one, another checkmate puzzle, and a couple things to think about as well. Okay? First of all, this bishop can move, right? Because Zugzwang has to do with usually, a king or a pawn where the pawn is stuck and it can't move and it's only the king moves. Or at least those are the puzzles that we've looked at already. In this case, the bishop can move anywhere. But let's picture it. If it's black to move and they play bishop f4, we have rook takes a7, checkmate in 1, because that rook is supported by the pawn. Our king guards b8, and the king is trapped in by his own pawn on b7. So if this bishop goes to any of these squares, it is rook takes a7, checkmate. So that tells us that it's a good idea to leave our rook on this a file. Another thing we're noticing is that is that this a pawn can push a6, which makes it so that then this bishop can move, because then there is no rook takes a7 because there's a pawn on a6, and rook takes a6, pawn takes a6 is going to result in a win for black. Actually, that would result if a6 and the rook decide to sack and try and play b7. I believe that would be a win for black. We can look in a second though. So we need to stop this pawn from pushing and keep our rook on the a file. What better way? Crazy looking move, rook a6, but the only move is pawn takes. Okay, we played b7 and now this is checkmate. Okay, I want to take a look at this for just 1 second. Because I was talking about a bunch of different ideas. If rook a6 and this bishop moves, rook takes a7. This is checkmate, of course, like I talked about. So this pawn can't move. It cannot take because of our nice pin, so that's a nice layer to the puzzle. If pawn takes, like we saw, this is checkmate. And here, as I was talking about, if, let's just say, a6, rook takes, maybe it looks like it works. It will not. This bishop is guarding b8. It's on b8, and this pawn is just going to run. So that was just something I spoke to that's important to note on. But rook a6, really great, really interesting Zugzwang move in that particular position. Okay, this position is white to move. Now this position is relatively tricky as well. There's other things we have to take into account. This king, first of all, cannot move. Important to notice. So what are black's moves? Black can play h5 or a6. Okay? Now we have to consider which one of these we want to happen and which one of these we don't want to happen. Or if we want to move our king away and let this king come out. We don't want to let this king come out. He's stuck in the corner. He's in a bad spot, especially because our pawns are going towards the 8th rank. If they get there with check, that is an extra tempo against this king, especially if they are in a race down the board. Oftentimes you'll see pawns racing to promote. So here, a6, we don't really want them to play a6. Not because a6 makes us lose the game, but because a6, first of all, is giving them a7 as an escape square if we ever want to promote with check. And it is just having this pawn on a6 guarding b7 is important. So what's more important than trying to understand the ups and downs of a6 is understanding why having black play h5 is super good for white. And that's because we are going to take and then promote. And like I talked about, once h5 is played, if we take, black has 1, 2, 3, 4 squares to promote. And we have 1, 2, 3 squares. But black gets to go first, you might be saying. Sure. So if pawn h5, pawn takes, g4, h6, g3, h7, g2, and like I said, h8 promoting with checkmate. Okay, so we'll see this play out. Pawn a6, we are going to stop this king from coming up. Stop any a6 push. They're forced to play h5. It's the only move on the board. Pawn takes, we are going to push down the board. Okay, they're not going to completely play it out, but I think it's kind of cool and important to see. After a6, h5, pawn takes, we are now marching down the board. Normally, we would promote at the same time, and it would be possibly a tricky endgame, possibly a drawn endgame with king, queen, king, queen. Now we can even promote to a rook if we want to. Yeah, this is just checkmate. I thought for some reason the pawn had promoted. It hasn't. Even if the pawn was promoted going to g8, it would still be taken. But rook h8 checkmate or promoting to a queen checkmate. Both of these are completely valid wins. Interestingly enough, no, never mind. I apologize. Never mind. Okay, so that concludes this lesson on Zugzwang. Of course, sometimes Zugzwang can be employed in the middle games, although it is more rare. And if you think about it, that makes sense, right? Because Zugzwang is more common in endgames. Because what are endgames? Endgames are when there are less pieces on the board. So there are less possible squares for pieces to move. So it's easier to make it so that any move on the board is a bad move. When you have a middle game and you've got knights, bishops, rooks, pawns, there's a lot more possibilities for your opponents or for you to play, and just a higher percentage chance that you have a good move, or at least a move that's not just going to lose the game. So, Zugzwang, it is a very important topic, particularly in endgames, and it is also very confusing. So I recommend you try it out. I recommend you be on the lookout for it in your games, because once you have, well, I don't even think you can master a tool like Zugzwang. You are actively thinking about it, but once you have practiced Zugzwang and learn how to use it in your games, it is going to make your endgame skills and also just your skills throughout the game about calculating and about thinking about your opponent's moves just that much better. So I hope to see that, and I'll see you guys in my next video.